Hey, I've only got a little bit of time, so if you want to quickly discuss Noah's Ark, I have a question for you in regards to it.
Oh, boom. Okay.
So, as far as you made a claim that it was 8,000 animal kinds, roughly speaking, that made it onto
Estimated
the Ark.
8,000.
So, where do you get that estimation from?
You know what? I can't quote to you a source because I heard it on a YouTube channel. And then
Okay.
I looked into it on Google.
Okay.
There's not a
Ayden,
lot of information on it.
Ayden, you could probably contact either creation.com or Answers in Genesis.
Well, sure, that's great. I'm not necessarily concerned with that. I'm concerned with because I'm having a conversation with Stephen right now. So I'm concerned with how Stephen gathered this information because he posited it the last time we had a discussion about this topic. So, going from that point, so that's just I'll just assume for a moment that it's 8,000 animal kinds that are on this thing. So, all in all, you got 16,000 creatures on this one boat, the dimensions of which are specifically given in Genesis in cubits. Now we have the measurement conversion for cubits to modern systems of measurement.
Mm-hmm.
I have to ask you because the Ark specifically only has one window, and according to Genesis, that window is closed over the course of the entire journey on the ocean.
No.
So
it is. It had one door, but it may have had multiple windows.
I really wish I could actually talk with Steven. This was purported as a debate between me and Steven.
Wait a minute. No, the debate was going to be set up for another time. You're on an open panel tonight.
Sure. Well, sure. Okay. If that's how things are going to go, then I don't necessarily have a problem with that. I just thought that was how things were going to be arranged.
No one told me it was a debate between you two.
Well, apparently there's going to be a debate between us at some point here because Steven changed his mind. What I was trying to say to you, though, is that the amount of methane that 16,000 creatures are going to produce over the course of... You have two different interpretations of how long the events of the flood of the earth go on for.
About a year.
There's either 40 days or 40 nights or 11 months to a year, as most modern Christians interpret it as. So all of that methane being confined in such a small space from them exhaling... I do want to correct you
because I'm checking out the arkencounter.com, and according to their information, it would have been 6,744 animals total, not 1,600. So that's...
No, I said it was actually
already cut in half the amount of methane you're speaking of.
No, that doesn't more than cut in half the amount of methane because I was talking about 16,000 creatures, and now it's reduced to a little under 14,000. So
that's according to the Ark Encounter.
Okay, so that's not cutting it in half either way. That's not math.
Still, Ayden, you see my point, though.
No, it reduces it by only 2,000.
I just took the wind out of those sails.
No, you didn't. You only reduced it by 2,000 creatures. That's not half. That's
well,
not
I said 8,000 kinds. That would have been at least 1,600 animals, Ayden. I know they teach basic math.
No, they
in
teach
Canada.
2 of every kind, though. It's 2 of every kind.
No, sir, it's 2 of every. It's 2 of every unclean. It's 7 pair of every clean. So
right,
you're
so
not
even more in those.
On that,
oh, right,
Ayden.
No, you're right. Even more in that specific circumstance. So we got to factor in even more creatures than what we originally were talking about.
The estimated total is 6,744. I read the number to you.
Which somehow begot 8 million animal species across the world.
Yeah,
but I'm just curious how, like, it's such a small amount of species over what you purport to be only thousands of years somehow proliferated into 8 million different species, none of which, by the way, can interbreed with one another because they are so genetically distinct from one another.
Have you ever had pet bunnies?
I've not had pet
reasonable.
Rabbits, no.
My own parents have 7 children. It's very reasonable.
So only one kind, though, of those animals, like things like penguins and seals, they decided that from Turkey they wandered all the way to Antarctica.
I can't tell you if penguin is considered a clean animal or not. I've never considered eating a penguin, to be honest.
But did they wander all the way from the Ark to Antarctica and lower South America from where they were in modern Turkey?
It says that God brought them to the Ark. Now, does that mean they walked the whole way? I'm not sure. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob could have literally...
He had a magic carpet
gravitated them up and appeared them in the Ark. I don't know how he did it, but God brought them to the Ark.
Plus, we know the Earth wasn't like it is now. The land masses weren't the same. We've talked about this before.
Right, you're right. There's so much water that's described in the flood myth that it would literally take over twice the amount of water in not only all of the oceans
flood.
across the
Myths
world,
aren't
but
If
the
that's
true.
not
atmosphere.
willingly ignorant.
It's not
My-
willingly ignorance. By the way, it's willfully ignorant, first of all,
I-
Stephen. And
I just finished
secondly,
it yesterday.
Are you
willful
ignorant
ignorance.
willingly?
Well, no, I'm not, because I know the story. I know the story, and I know that it's not true, because the evidence that we have in the modern geologic column and the modern understanding
Whose
of our world
evidence,
around
Ayden?
us,
Totally
the evidence of the
unbiased
scientific
evidence,
body.
Of course.
Oh, unlike yours, which is unbiased, totally.
At least
and
we
completely.
admit to being biased to a
Well, no,
holy
I have
God.
admitted readily
We
that we're
don't hide
biased.
it. We don't
Science,
cover
science
it up.
absolutely has always had, like, there have always been scientists with a bias, but science itself is not biased.
Why
Hey,
isn't that in the textbooks?
Scientists are biased. What, that
The
scientists are biased?
information is compiled by biased scientists.
Yeah,
and
that's
it's
a
published
basic
through
inference.
biased
Hold on.
publications.
You just asked why
Why
isn't that
don't
in the
they
textbook?
notify
Stop
their-
talking over
their
me.
readers?
Stop talking over me. Excuse
It's
me,
my
Steven.
show. I'll
Excuse
talk
me.
over whoever I please, Ayden. Why don't they put that information in the textbooks as
Because
a
that's a
warning?
basic inference that you can make about any human being, that they're biased. Even according to your religion, human beings are inherently biased. So please tell me what person, without making a basic inference about what human beings are and what they operate on, would not realize inherently that human beings are biased.
Hey,
That's a
where
pretty.
are all the fossils?
That's about as ridiculous of a label as putting a "do not eat" label on mattresses. Like, it's inherent that
How
that's
did
the case.
clams get on top of Mount Everest, Ayden?
The
They
only
got on
reason
top of
there
Mount
would be
Everest.
a do
I've got a
not
good
eat
explanation.
label on a mattress is if somebody had tried
I
to eat
mean,
that mattress.
There's no
Right, so there's
way
a very
you
small
want
minority of
that
people
except
that
for
are so ignorant about what's going on they need to be informed about extremely basic things. Fine, that's perfectly fine. That's part
How
of
do-
human nature, as what we described it earlier.
Ho-
Somebody asked
hold
me a
on,
question,
hold on,
though.
hold
How did clams end up on Mount Everest? They asked me, though.
Is this what Ryan just asked?
Yeah.
Yeah, how
Okay,
did they end up
okay,
on
go
Mount
ahead.
Everest? So mountains, as far as we're concerned with tectonic plates, plate tectonics, as far as mountains are concerned, are far younger than those of the ones that we find on the ocean floor. Far larger mountains like Mount Everest have been proven to be much younger because the rocks that we can carbon date and radiometrically date that are found on the upper layers of those mountains are shown to be younger than those on the lower layers of those mountains. But because over the course of millions of years they were pushed up, in the case of the Rocky Mountains, the Himalayas were created by the collision of the Indian subcontinent with the rest of Asia. I believe that was about 100 million years ago, but we can get into that at another point.
Okay.
Anyways, the reason why you'll find clams on top of those mountains, though, is because those mountains are very young, and because when those
Yeah, they are
when
young.
the
You're right
plates
about
were
that.
pushed up, well, yeah, they're younger than the rest of the surface of the Earth that you see, though.
Okay, that's a pretty good explanation. Even though I don't believe it.
Well, like, here, let me real quick. I'll just finish this up. Let me give you an illustrative example. So the two main mountain belts that run across America, the Rocky Mountains and Appalachia. The Appalachian Mountains in Eastern America are much older than the Rocky Mountains in Western America. And one of the ways that we can tell that is based on how flat the Appalachian Mountains are compared to the Rocky Mountains. And the reason why that's the case is erosion. They've been around above the surface of the Earth much longer, and therefore, as a result of that, the wind and the tides and other natural forces have had much more time to buffer against them and basically flatten them out. So the Himalayas, which you see, which are the tallest mountain range on the world, are actually by one of the products of that, because of tectonic plates, the youngest mountain range on the Earth.
I think the fact that all the clams are found closed means that they were buried rapidly, which
Yeah.
would be explained by the flood narrative.
Well, all fossils are
Well-
by rapid burial, right?
That's actually a brilliant point, that all fossils are preserved by rapid burial. That's literally exactly what I was about to say, is that you only get fossilization of creatures when they are buried rapidly. But I only say that because the reason why this comes up all the time as far as the fossil record is concerned, as far as the flood is concerned, though, when it comes to the geologic column of fossil burials, if we saw that everything was buried rapidly, then things that are much larger, things like whales and sharks and lions and elephants, we would find those buried at the bottom because they're the heaviest. That makes sense. If they're heavier, they're going to sink to the bottom. But that's not what we see. What we see in the fossil record is very distinctive layers, and those layers do not mix with one another. We don't see a trilobite in a layer that's only 10,000 years old, for example, because trilobites have not existed for millions of years at this point. And the reason why is because it has taken an immense amount of time for each one of these layers to form. That would not be the case if they were all rapidly deposited in a flood.
Ayden, that would make sense, except they have petrified trees all across the earth that go through millions of years of your guys' made-up time frames.
Oh, well, you know what? I actually got a perfect response to that. There's a study that I could post in the chat that specifically refutes what you're talking about. There are specific trees whose roots, yes, will go beneath other different layers.
The entire
but the trunk
tree.
Itself, no. I was just about to say.
Hundreds and hundreds
just let
of
me finish,
pictures
Stephen.
of them, Ayden.
Let me finish.
Through
please.
Millions of years.
No, you're not going to let me finish.
Okay. Rescue device.
So you're going to get offended when I say the flood myth, but you can say things like made up offhandedly, and I'm supposed to just take that with a shrug.
You know what? Okay. You're right. I'm sorry. I take that back, Ayden.
What I'm trying to communicate through this, though, is that the trees that you're discussing are only trees that we can observe can be buried up to extreme depths and still put down roots below those depths. They are still trees that are capable of surviving and growing underground to a very large extent. And I can give you a couple of studies why that's the case. So we have to use Occam's razor at that point and decide, okay, either this is the case of it being an example of a tree that we can readily observe in reality all around us, or it's the case that this is one of the only things that we have at our disposal to explain a myriad of other things which are unexplainable within the flood narrative. I won't say myth, the flood narrative.
Right, because I could easily come back and say you guys developed another theory to plug the holes in your original theory.
No, that's what religion does, though. You take something that...
We haven't had to plug anything in
you do,
2,000 plus years of written word.
Ken Hovind
consistent for 3,000 years.
I'm only bringing this up because it's pertinent to what we're talking about. People
Is
like Ken
though?
Hovind... Yes, it is. Yes, it is. People like Kent Hovind wouldn't make an entire career about rebutting and refuting, so to speak, evolution if you didn't have to plug holes as new evidence emerged to contradict ideas that were already present within Scripture. The history of the church has been nothing but the history of plugging holes that have become available when more data has been presented to us. Now, if you want to accept those pluggings of those holes as fact based on your religion, then that's fine, but that is in fact what it is. Science doesn't assume anything, Stephen. The scientific method and how it's conducted does not assume anything. And science...
What is black matter, Ayden?
You mean dark matter?
Dark matter, yes. What is it?
Well,
it's a placeholder, right? Because we don't know what really goes there.
No, it's not a placeholder.
That's
we can prove that it exists.
That's incorrect. It's a placeholder.
See, look at you, Stephen.
That's
I'm not giving you the answer you want, and you're getting all upset with me.
It's another
You're getting all upset with me. Is this? Hold on. You just gave me a question. What is this? And I gave you an answer, and you're like, no, it's not. No, it's not. That's not very ingenious in a debate.
Because we both know you're going to do this dance no matter what we say.
No, I'm not. Because unlike you, Stephen, I don't have a pre-planned script when I try to deal with things like this. I can actually change what I think.
Pre-planned script?
Yes, you've even talked about it. Hold on.
Changing God, but I'm grateful for that.
You've even talked about this before, both on your show and Chuck's, about this line of reasoning, quote unquote, that you go through with people where you ask them this question, and then based on what they say, you'll ask them this question, and based on what they say, you'll ask them.
And did you?
So you absolutely do have a pre-prepared narrative of what you're going to say before you say it.
Oh, I do have an opening dialogue. Prepared
more
opening,
than an opening
dialogue.
You've gone through more than an opening dialogue's worth of discussion about what you would do given somebody's answers to the specific questions that you had posed.
Ayden, it seems like my rebuttals were more offensive to you than your statements were to me.
But it's not offensive to me. I'm only pointing out something that you yourself have conducted.
Never mind.
What, Ryan?
Well, the James Webb Telescope was expected to see all the way back in time to when galaxies were forming. However, every galaxy it saw was already fully formed as far away as it could see.
So how are quasars explainable given that? And why do we not see any quasars close to ourselves, but can only see them back in the very earliest stages of the universe? Even before the James Webb Space Telescope, that was the case. I mean, quasars are objects that are so bright that they literally outshine galaxies that are orders of magnitude closer than those quasars. And they are not things that we see anywhere except in the earliest stages of our universe. So there absolutely are things that precede the formation of galaxies. The problem is that when you look back that far, like with the James Webb Space Telescope, and you're only using the red spectrum of light when everything is so redshifted over to it, you're not able to see with as much definition as you would be able to see an object with something like visible light for now.
Okay.
Now, that's not always going to be the case. I'd actually say that the James Webb Space Telescope, not quite like the Hubble Space Telescope, where they would actually have astronauts go up and service it. Unlike the Hubble, though, the James Webb Space Telescope has software on it that's readily changeable. It's readily adjustable as we come up with better software in order to fine-tune it given the data it provides us. Now, is it going to find more definitive evidence in the earliest stages of our universe of how galaxies formed? I'm not sure, because that data isn't available yet. However, based on the data that we do have available to us right now with things like quasars and the cosmic microwave background, what I can say is that galaxy formation is something that, roughly speaking, did not happen for a few million years after the formation of the universe, because of the temperature of the universe being so hot that even basic molecules weren't able to form for, I believe, some 300,000 years, until after the Big Bang and its initial event. Sorry, I'm dominating the conversation. Somebody else go ahead.
Well, that's a little bit beyond my expertise. I'd have to have somebody like Jason Miles sit next to me to be able to really respond to that.
I gotta
have
tell
a
you,
question
man.
for Ayden.
Go ahead, Christian.
Ayden, I think you and I may have a similar view about this. I just wanted to get your thoughts on it. My biggest issue with the idea of the traditional rendition of the Noah's Ark story being 4,400 years ago is genetic proliferation, as you mentioned earlier. And there is no number that makes it reasonable, whether it's 1,000, 4,000, 16,000, or 50,000. When I had my discussion with Kent Hovind, I was discussing the evolution of the horse's foot. And I told him that you have to go one of two ways. Either A, you have to acknowledge drastic morphological change, or B, your number of species on the ark increases dramatically. So you can't really have it, without accepting one of those two. So that being said, genetic proliferation for the last 4,400 years, taking some number between 1,000 and 50,000 animal species and turning it into literally 8 million animal species is not just impossible, it's radically impossible.
Well,
do you share that point of view?
I do, and I find it very funny that the same people that will unironically try to claim that some 10,000, whether you think it's 1,000, 10,000, 50,000, they think that over the course of thousands of years, they proliferated into this number of species. But those very same people will tell you things like, oh, well, we can't see a dog become a non-dog within a human lifetime. Therefore, it can't become anything but a dog. Well, if that's the case, then we wouldn't have such amazing diversification of species across the world. At some point, as you said, there's either
that's actually one reason that I believe that even like Brother Hovind is a Darwinian without wanting to accept that, because to believe that a few thousand species can diversify into several million species, which are dramatically distinct from one another, and not through artificial selection, but through a much slower and less guided natural selection, you have to be a Darwinian to believe that.
It's either that, or you have to believe that God has such an incredible hold over every event in the universe that he specifically engineered all of those creatures from that point to be exactly what they are now. But then the question comes into play of, well, then clearly, if that's the case, then why does the Bible claim that Adam and Eve named every single species upon the earth? Because that can't be the case. If every single species upon the earth, every kind that ever existed and walked upon this earth, if they were all named by Adam and Eve, then we wouldn't have a much larger proliferation of those species upon the earth than we would have had before.
Well, this is one point that I've made to the gentleman. I don't know how often you watch the broadcast, Ed, but there's been numbers of times that me and some of the fellows here have discussed this and my views on Darwinian worldview and things like that. And my position is that, I believe in the Bible. My position is it's not possible for us to have any idea what any of those original created animals must have looked like. it does give us some vague categories. If you're going to make an allowance for scripture for the sake of argument, it does give us the vague categories of fowl of the air, fish of the sea, etc. But the idea that we would have any idea what the morphology or the behavior of those original animals would look like is ridiculous, because not only do we know about selection, if you look at the Noah's Ark narrative the way it's usually accepted, then you have this insane super selection. So it becomes that much more abstract to go back in time biologically.
As far as the proliferation of species upon the earth in such a brief amount of time is concerned, what I've always been curious about and what I've always asked creationists and never really necessarily gotten a sufficient answer to is, when it comes to all of those species coming out of this one boat over such a long period of time on this ark, as he says it is, how could they have possibly not only kept all of those animals on that boat, but kept all of the food for those animals on that boat, not even mentioning all of the species which are specifically carnivorous? This is post-Eden, so there are carnivorous species on the earth. Death has come into the world at this point in time, so there are only carnivorous species. So Noah would have had to have taken other fresh animals onto the ark as a necessity, because there are plenty of animals that will not eat already killed game. They have to eat it live, otherwise they just won't consume it. He has to bring all the food for the herbivores, and he has to somehow find a way to light a torch or have some sort of light source down there in order to distribute that food without causing a methane fire of such epic proportions that the ark basically goes up like a firecracker. So as far as that is concerned, that very clearly says to me that this is it's a mythical tale. And I say it's a mythical tale because I'm sure that there are events like very regional floods that the biblical flood are based upon. I know one of the things that a lot of people will try to say is, oh, well, every society has a different flood narrative. Well, yeah, all those societies also happen to live next to rivers. So it's that's surprising that they're all going to have a flood myth, especially Mesopotamian societies where the river doesn't flood necessarily on a regular schedule like Egypt.
Well, if you look at Australia, this is one example that's often given to, at the very most generous, challenge the common flood narrative, is the very niche marsupials, which are in Australia, New Zealand, and Tasmania. So you don't just have a collection of marsupials, but you have extremely niche marsupials. You have marsupial tigers and the such like. So you have areas that when there was not a mammalian group to occupy a niche, one developed, but it developed from a marsupial ancestor. So it's occupying the niche like a tiger or like something else, but it's doing it as a marsupial because of how selection works. And so we know with beyond any reasonable doubt that something that is marsupial can greatly diversify to fill niches in places like Australia. I guess that's, I don't know. I don't understand it. To me, it's about like the flat earth thing. You get to a certain point where it's like, come on, guys.
Some people, it gets to a point, and I'm not saying anybody here says it. I'm not sure if they purport this, but I've heard people go as far as saying things like, dinosaur bones are only put there for Satan to test our faith or something like that. It's like, it gets to that kind of point in my mind where I'm like, okay,
that's not true. Yeah.
You either have to.
That's without a question a nut job.
Well, yeah, no, and like I said, I don't think anybody in this room, and it's been confirmed now, nobody in this room holds that position, but I've just most certainly heard it from people, and I only bring it up because it's a good illustrative example of if somebody is so dedicated to believing in something, if they are so steadfast in whatever you want to call it, whether it be faith or religion or anything of that sort of thing, any sort of idea that somebody tethers themselves to so fundamentally, they will make massive logical leaps in order to try and make up for that idea. And I bring this up because one thing I hear in response whenever I say things like that is like, oh, well, that's just like you. Well, yeah, only to the extent that I am a fellow human being. And yeah, I'm going to have bias, like we just mentioned earlier. Everyone's going to have bias, but I've said it before on occasions. I want there to be a God. It'd be great if there was a God.
I have another question for you.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just think
about
stuff like that. This is really a little bit unrelated to the extent that I don't personally believe in abiogenesis, but I think it's very interesting to study. And the other day, I was discussing with some of the fellows here that I have, as of very recently, a bit of a different take. The biggest hurdle that pretty much all people who fall in the category of creationists have against abiogenesis is mathematics. Well, I was thinking about this the other day, and I think it's very possible to make the argument that the leap from single to multicellular reproductive organisms is quite possibly a larger mathematical improbability than abiogenesis self-replicating organic proteins themselves. What do you think of that?
I hate to burst your bubble, but I actually disagree with you there.
Tell me why. I'm curious.
Yeah, no, go ahead. It's the fact that multicellularity is something that we've actually observed within laboratory settings that have evolved within as little as 6 days. We've been able to get a singular cellular organism within and I will say this, it was in very specific conditions, but they were able to put it under circumstances where it began replicating multicellularly within 6 days. So I don't think that multicellularity is the biggest hurdle to overcome with this in the slightest. I think that abiogenesis, as far as inorganic compounds forming anything that is as complex as RNA, is really the only building block that we have left, because the Miller-Urey experiment bridged us almost all the way there.
I've always felt like that once you get to complex multicellular and especially sexual reproduction, at that point that the floodgate is wide open for morphological change.
No, definitely. Mitosis is a much more slower way of proliferating.
Yeah, my thought was, how do you get from single cell to multicell, and especially to the exchanging of genes in sexual reproduction? That seems to be a major hurdle, but I understand what you're saying. I don't know. That's the reason I was asking.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I might have misunderstood you then. I guess to just clarify, you're more talking about the leap from mitosial production to
I really am. I really am.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. I definitely do have to agree that it's a gap. I don't think it's as big of a gap as the one between the developing of base RNA compounds into complex DNA compounds. I think that's a bit of a bigger one. But as far as that one is concerned, we can explain up to, I believe sexual reproduction, is, at least it's theorized that it only came about as a result of a mutation, that rather than it splitting off and making a direct copy of itself, it instead made another copy of or developed.
So you think it was just a random, mutation? It wasn't some crazy conditional thing?
I think it's actually a combination of the two. I think the mutation by itself wouldn't be able to survive without specific environmental conditions, and I don't think environmental conditions specifically wouldn't bring about the huge change that a mutation needs to bring. So I think it's kind of a combination of both of them, is what I'm trying to say.
Let me ask you something else while I have you on here. Do you believe it's reasonable to draw a line anywhere in genetics to stop the assumption of relatedness?
No, and I only say that that's not the case because if you go back further and further along the fossil record, and even after the fossil record, any actual living tissue that we have of the life that we have on this earth today, if we trace it further and further back, we will find that they eventually do have identical morphological changes that split off from a common ancestor. And I don't think that there's any single point in which we have found where there's just a complete deviation from that. Now, is it possible that all life on Earth could have started in multiple different places, but eventually homogenized into one thing?
I have heard that theory before.
That is definitely a possibility, but I don't think that has as much validity per se as the idea that we all share a common ancestor.
And do you accept that soft tissue has been found in dinosaur bones? Or
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, how would it be preserved for millions of years?
It's actually a really good question. I had it myself. I actually went to the specific exhibit that has this soft tissue you're talking about on display. It's in the Royal Tyrrell Museum in Alberta. I went to go see it, and they have a brilliant explanation of why it was able to be preserved. It was because of the specific way that it was buried, not only buried, but the layers that formed directly after its burial. I forget the specific name of them. I'd have to look it up. But all I could tell you off the top of my head right before I'm about to get back to work is, from what I read, it was a specific layer of material that came directly after its burial that allowed it to have much more preservation than most dinosaur bones, because most of the time what you see is not necessarily the bone itself with fossilization. You see a calcification of something that basically fills in the gap of what the bone used to be, but that isn't the case with this one specific one you're talking about. But real quick, Christian.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll just say that one that we have found, if we found those all the time, if it was not just one incredible outlier out of other tens of thousands.
Many have been found, I thought.
There's more than one. Is there more than one?
There's more than one.
I would have to look into that. Maybe there is. I'd have to look into it.
Okay, it's kind of a double question.
Oh boy.
Christian, I was just about to give the floor to Stump because he's been quiet for so long, and now you're hitting us with a double question.
No, go ahead. Let him have his question. I mean, because
I never
you can't respond to anything because it goes on so long.
As soon as Ayden answers this, it's going to Stump, and then
you can't even challenge anything because it goes on, then it changes things.
I know.
That's pretty good. That's a pretty good technique to hide things. But go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh really? I mean, I'll
really.
address things one at a time if you want. Like, if you really think I'm trying to hide anything, I have nothing to hide, sir. But you can go ahead and make that little drive-by assertion of yours before I go. It's very brave of you. Very brave.
Ask his thing.
Two-part question, Ayden. Number one, do you think that a panspermia for single-celled or self-replicating molecules is reasonable? And number two, if you do think panspermia is reasonable, do you think it's an indication of outside intelligent life?
I think that panspermia, if it is true, and as far as your first question, all I have to say is I don't know, because panspermia, as far as how it could have happened, there are so many different methods through which it could have happened. Now, I don't think that intelligent life, to try and answer your second one, is the more likely of the two. I think that it's probably through naturalistic causes that panspermia happens.
Okay.
Look, I managed to answer it without going on for 10 minutes.
Look,
it's a miracle.
I'm done, Stump. You can have my apologize for hogging the live stream.
That's okay. Let Ayden go. He got to go.
No, I could answer you. You were saying that I was trying to be sneaky or something like that earlier. You have something to say? Go ahead.
I just know you said probably about 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes ago, you said that on the ark they had a carnivorous diet. When Scripture doesn't say that.
Well, some of them would have had a carnivorous diet, because A, death would have already entered into the earth at that point in time, and B, if they didn't have a carnivorous diet and all of them were herbivorous, then that would make another huge chasm of a gap as far as how you can explain such a huge proliferation of different species in such a short time. If they're all herbivorous, then they would have had to have completely developed different ways of existing at that point, because this is post-Eden. This is after death has already entered into the world. It's not like God is making a huge sweeping change on these creatures at this point. So you would then have to explain how carnivorism developed over only a few thousand years.
Well, that's your idea. You're using Scripture that you don't believe in to say that death came in the world of Eden, but Scripture says that after Noah's flood, he told Noah that now he would have a carnivorous diet. So
if death wouldn't have been
happening as part of the ark, before the flood. So
of course I'm using Scripture I don't believe in to argue with you, because if I just go off the basis that I don't believe it, we're not able to move forward and have a discussion whatsoever, and that's not very interesting, is it?
Well, you can't use Scripture you don't believe in it if you don't.
I absolutely can. I'm doing it right now. I'm doing it right now.
I just told you that he spoke to Noah and said that now you would have a carnivorous diet after the flood.
Right. After death,
and you're telling me
across the entire world.
You're telling me no. Science says you got to develop. You got to develop. You haven't let me finish my sentence.
Go ahead.
You have to develop thousands of years to go here and there, but then you're trying to prove it with the Bible, which you don't believe. So that's not argument.
It's not true in the slightest. Actually, what I was trying to say was that if death had not already entered into the world at that point in time, then the flood would have been useless, because nothing would have been killed in it. So yes, obviously, up until the flood and right before it, when the animals got on it, there would have had to have been some animals that had a carnivorous diet, because otherwise, after God made the change of death coming into the world, there's no scripture whatsoever that says that God made some change that made a group of animals carnivorous after it. The only thing that you have to say that is that God said to Noah personally and for his family that only they then could have a carnivorous diet. That does not mean that the other animals then followed that same rule. You're just making a broad assertion that has no backing whatsoever. So
Where
that's
then
absolutely ridiculous.
show me where scripture, since you might use scripture, where it says that animals were eating flesh at that time before the flood. Point to it for me.
Oh, I just explained to you why that would be the case.
No, I don't want you to
because
explain
God-
to me. I want you to use scripture because you're trying to prove with scripture. Show me the scripture that says it. I pointed one to you.
I'll point it to you as soon as you find me the scripture that says God suddenly allowed all of the animals that got off the mark to.
I
be
told you where it was.
carnivorous all of a sudden.
It's in Genesis
No, you
chapter
didn't.
9 when he spoke to
You
Noah.
said that you said that he spoke to Noah. He didn't say that to any of the other animals. So you're moving
Well,
the goalposts there.
God doesn't speak to the animals.
Well, no, but he would obviously
beings.
be the one that dictates their
Well, there you
behavior.
go.
No, he would be
Okay.
the one that dictates their behavior
right.
and their nature, would he not?
Okay, well, I just wanted to make my point. Like I said, it takes an hour to get in to say something, and it's already a different subject by then.
That's a lovely little sniping
That was my
remark you
point I
made
was
at the
trying to
end there,
make.
Stump. That's a lovely little sniping remark you made. It's very
It's
cute.
true. It's true. You
Well-
run on, and then by the time you get back to it,
I directly addressed everything you said. There's nothing that I did not address in what you
Oh,
said.
yeah, I
so
know.
that's ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I know I'm not going to prove anything to you. It ain't going to happen. So it's good. I mean, I just want to make that point.
If you're trying to prove that you're not going to change my mind, I can levy that exact same accusation back at you. So I don't know where that's going to get you.
You won't change my mind. You're right.
All right. Well, off of that, have a good rest of the night, everybody. If anybody has any, what was that? Sorry. Have a good rest of your night, everybody. Take care.